Is this your idea of honor, General? The question sliced through the laughter like glass against metal. Every voice in the officers' club froze. Crystal glasses hung midair and the low hum of arrogance evaporated in an instant. That night, at the prestigious Ramstein Air Base Officers Club, victory was being celebrated. Champagne, medals, self-congratulation. But beneath the polished mahogany and cigar smoke, something far more profound was about to unfold. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories so you never miss these fascinating tales of courage. And let us know in the comments where you're watching today. The club itself was an ode to military pride. Dark oak panels, shelves lined with history, portraits of men cast in bronze glory, an air so thick with nostalgia it almost seemed sacred. It was the kind of place where laughter was practiced and respect was assumed. On that night, the center of attention was Brigadier General Marcus Dorn, a man who'd built his career not in the mud or the battlefield but behind polished desks and immaculate reports. His voice carried the smug rhythm of authority, his medals clinking softly as he toasted to the efficiency and strength of modern command. Across the room, unseen by most, an old janitor worked quietly in the corner, polishing a glass display case that contained a weathered pilot's helmet from the Vietnam era. His name tag read Albert Kidding, but no one paid attention to that. He moved slowly, a measured limp in his left leg, his gray uniform blending into the dim corners of the room. His hands, scarred steady, handled the relics with more reverence than any man in the room. To the officers, he was invisible. To Dorn, he was an eyesore. "Gentlemen," Dorn announced, setting down his glass with deliberate grace, "let's make this an educational moment." He strode across the carpet, every step rehearsed authority. The laughter died as he loomed behind the janitor. "This is an event for officers and invited guests," he said sharply. "Your shift ended an hour ago. Care to explain why you're still here?" Albert looked up, calm and polite. "Just doing my job, sir. Making sure everything stays in order." Dorn smirked, eyes narrowing. "Your presence ruins the atmosphere. This hall is for warriors, for men who've shaped history, not for mops and rags." A few captains chuckled nervously. Albert nodded faintly. "Understood, sir. I'll pack up," but Dorn wasn't finished. He wanted an audience, and humiliation was his sport. "Tell me, old man," he pressed, voice dripping with mockery. "Did you ever serve, or was your closest brush with discipline a bucket of bleach?" As Albert bent to gather his cleaning supplies, the sleeve of his uniform lifted slightly, revealing an old, faded tattoo, a coiled viper ready to strike. Dorn pointed with a laugh. "What's that? Souvenir from a plumbing disaster? What was your call sign, huh?" Albert's voice was steady, almost too quiet. "Viper 1. The name dropped like a weight in still water. Silence spread through the room, deep and heavy. One of the older men at the bar, Sergeant Major Henry Kowalski, turned pale, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering against the floor. He'd heard that name before. Once. Long ago, over a crackling radio deep in the jungles of Cambodia. The party had ended, though no one yet realized it. Kowalski's breathing grew ragged. His eyes, once dulled by years of routine, now burned with recognition and disbelief. "Sir," he whispered hoarsely to General Dorn, "I'd advise you to stop right there." Dorn turned sharply, irritation flaring. "Excuse me?" "I said stop." Kowalski's voice was louder now, carrying the weight of memory. "I remember that name, Viper 1. I heard it in 1971 when my platoon was cornered near the Cambodian border. A full North Vietnamese company was about to wipe us out. Then a voice came through the radio, calm, precise. It gave us coordinates. Within minutes, air support came out of nowhere. Saved every man still breathing." He paused, his throat tightening. That voice identified itself as Viper 1. A hush fell over the room, so complete it felt physical. Dorn's smirk faltered for the first time, though he tried to hide it behind a scoff. "You expect me to believe this janitor is some covert legend?" he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Albert Kidding didn't respond. He simply met Dorn's gaze with an unshakable calm that carried the weight of forgotten wars. The faint hum of the ceiling fans became the only sound in the hall. Then, without warning, the heavy wooden doors of the officers' club burst open. The sound echoed like a rifle crack. Two men in dark suits entered first, scanning the room with trained precision. Behind them came General Leonard Wallace, commander of the Air Combat Command. His reputation preceded him, cold, meticulous, the kind of man who carried silence like a weapon. Attention. Someone barked, and the entire room snapped to rigid posture. But Wallace didn't return their salutes. His eyes were fixed solely on the old janitor in the corner. He walked directly toward him, each step measured, deliberate. When he reached Albert, he stopped and saluted. The gesture stunned the room. No one breathed. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Kidding," Wallace said softly. "An honor long overdue." Dorn's confusion twisted into unease. "Sir," he stammered, "with all due respect, that man is just enough." Wallace's tone sliced through him like a blade.
"General Dorn, do you have any idea who you just addressed?"
"Sir, he's maintenance staff." Wallace closed his eyes for a second as though the words physically pained him. "Maintenance staff," he repeated quietly. Then his gaze turned cold. "That man is the reason you and I stand here breathing." A murmur rippled across the room. Officers glanced at one another, disbelief mixing with awe. During the Vietnam War, Wallace continued, Viper 1 led deep reconnaissance teams through enemy territory. Missions so classified that not even the Pentagon dared to write them down. He saved lives that were never counted, prevented wars that were never reported. He was captured once in a place that officially doesn't exist, and escaped after carrying 2 wounded men across 80 miles of jungle. And after the war, he kept working for his country. Quietly, invisibly, he turned to Dorn, his voice like frost. "You have humiliated a man who has done more for this nation than you ever will." The room was silent again, but this silence was different, charged, reverent. Dorn stood motionless, color draining from his face. Every officer in the room could see it now. The unraveling of arrogance, the smallness of a man exposed before true greatness. Wallace stepped closer, his tone now low but final. "Tomorrow, 6 a.m., my office. Full dress uniform. Bring your resignation letter." Then he turned back to Albert. "Sir," he said quietly, "it's time you came home." Albert didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. A quiet acceptance, the closing of a very long chapter. He nodded once as though saluting a memory. No one in the room dared move as the weight of that moment settled over them like fog after a storm. The once celebratory air had turned solemn, reverent. General Dorn stood pale and rigid, his authority stripped bare. Every clink of ice in a forgotten glass seemed deafening. General Wallace's eyes stayed on Kidding, but his voice carried across the hall with controlled precision. "You see, gentlemen," he said, scanning the crowd, "honor isn't written in reports or displayed in medals. It's carried by men who never ask to be remembered." He motioned toward Albert. This man was known across 3 Allied intelligence divisions. His code name, Viper 1, was whispered in places where silence meant survival. He led operations so far beyond the line that even now, decades later, much of it remains classified above your clearance levels. A low murmur rippled through the ranks. Young officers shifted uneasily, realizing that the man they'd walked past countless times, offering maybe a curt nod, maybe nothing at all, had done more than they could comprehend. Dorn tried to speak, his lips trembling slightly. "Sir, Wallace raised a hand. "Don't." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "You've said enough tonight." He turned back to Albert, his tone softening. "The nation owes you far more than a quiet janitor's life. There have been mistakes. Your benefits, your recognition, they will be restored immediately. But more than that, we remember, Albert. Those who know remember." For the first time, the old man's composure wavered. His eyes, steady through humiliation and silence, grew misty. He nodded faintly. "I never asked for any of that, sir. I only wanted peace." Wallace gave a faint, almost sorrowful smile. "Peace, Mr. Kidding, is a rare thing for men like you, but perhaps it's finally time." A moment of silence followed, a silence that spoke louder than any salute. Then Wallace looked toward Dorn once more, his expression cutting, absolute. "You will report as ordered. And consider this. Perhaps tonight you've learned what it really means to serve." With that, Wallace turned, gesturing subtly to the 2 men in suits. They moved toward the door but stopped when they realized no one else had moved. Every man and woman in that hall remained frozen, eyes fixed on the old janitor who had once been a ghost among them. Then quietly, Sergeant Major Kowalski straightened his uniform and raised his hand in a sharp salute. The gesture caught like wildfire. One by one, officers followed, their movements crisp and silent, until the entire hall stood at attention, every hand lifted to their brow, not for the general, not for a commander, but for the man who had spent years cleaning their floors in silence. Albert stood still, the faint gleam of the glass case behind him reflecting the scene like a mirror of redemption. There was no pride in his eyes, only a deep, weary melancholy. Somewhere in that silence, a young lieutenant whispered the name, Viper 1. The sound carried softly, as if the walls themselves remembered. Albert finally nodded, acknowledging the salute, his face shadowed by emotion too complex to name. It wasn't triumph, it was closure. Wallace's voice broke the stillness. "Let's go, sir," he said gently. Albert gathered his tools for the last time. The mop handle leaned against the wall, forgotten. When he turned toward the door, his gait had changed, no longer slow or weary. It was firm, silent, purposeful, the same stride that once crossed jungles under fire. As he passed through the hall, no one dropped their salute. No one spoke. They only watched the legend walk out of their world once more, quietly, humbly, and completely. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them with a slow, echoing thud, like the final note of a long-forgotten anthem. The sound lingered, mingling with the cold night air that slipped briefly into the room. For a long while, no one spoke. The officers, still standing at attention, remained locked in silence, unwilling to let the moment end. Inside, the mood had transformed entirely. The air that once smelled of scotch and arrogance now carried something different: respect, humility, and a sense of reckoning. It wasn't just that a legend had been uncovered. It was that every man there now saw his own reflection differently. General Dorn was the first to move. His posture sagged, metals glinting dully under the lights that suddenly felt too harsh. The authority he once wielded so effortlessly now seemed meaningless, a costume stripped of dignity. He turned toward the glass case Albert had been cleaning, a relic of the Vietnam era, and stared at it for a long, silent moment. The reflection staring back wasn't that of a general, but of a man exposed. Outside, under the faint hum of the base's floodlights, Albert Kidding and General Wallace walked side by side. Neither spoke at first. They didn't need to. The night carried its own rhythm, the distant engines of planes, the whisper of wind over the tarmac, the echo of decades buried under layers of silence. In the parking lot, a black government sedan waited, headlights off, its engine idling softly. Wallace gestured toward it, but Albert paused, his eyes drifting toward the far end of the runway where a line of aircraft stood silhouetted against the horizon. For a brief moment, he looked younger, his shoulders squared, his eyes steady with that same quiet vigilance that had guided men through hellish terrain half a century earlier. "I didn't think anyone would find me," he murmured. Wallace gave a small nod. "We never lost you, Albert. We just stopped looking. That was our mistake." Albert exhaled slowly, watching his breath fade into the chill. "I wasn't hiding, just trying to live where I wasn't needed anymore." Wallace's gaze softened. "Men like you never stop being needed, but maybe this time it's not your burden to carry." For the first time that night, Albert smiled, barely perceptible but real. "I only ever wanted quiet," he said, "not recognition." "And yet," Wallace replied, "your silence has spoken louder than most men's glory." They reached the car. Wallace opened the door, but Albert didn't enter immediately. His eyes swept over the base one last time, the lights, the hangars, the distant chatter of soldiers who would never know the ghosts that had built the ground beneath their feet. "Do they know what they stand on?" Albert asked quietly. "Not yet," Wallace said, "but after tonight they might start to." Albert nodded, a soft, accepting gesture. He placed his hand on the car door, then hesitated, looking down at his palm. The lines etched deep, rough, worn from a lifetime of service no one remembered. "They won't remember my name," he said. "They don't have to," Wallace replied. "They'll remember what it means." Albert finally stepped into the car. The door shut with a soft final click. Inside the club, the silence had turned reflective. The officers had begun to lower their salutes, but none dared speak above a whisper. Sergeant Major Kowalski remained standing, his jaw tight, eyes glistening. He whispered under his breath, "You saved my life, sir. I never even knew your face." The hum of the engine outside signaled the departure. The sedan rolled forward, disappearing slowly into the darkness beyond the runway lights. And with it went something none of them could quite name. A reminder, perhaps, of what real valor looked like when stripped of ceremony. The black sedan glided through the gates of Ramstein Air Base and vanished into the dark German countryside, its taillights dissolving into the mist like two small embers swallowed by night. Inside the officers' club, the sound of its departure faded slowly, replaced by a silence so deep it seemed to reach into every man's conscience. No one returned to their seats. No one picked up a drink. The music, long stopped, remained off. Sergeant Major Kowalski was still standing by the door, his eyes fixed on the space where the old man had stood minutes earlier. His voice, when it came, was rough and cracked. "He walked among us all these years," he murmured almost to himself. "And we never saw him," no one answered. They didn't have to. Every man in that room knew what he meant. General Dorn stood near the bar, his reflection warped in the glass of the Scotch bottle he'd once lifted with pride. His shoulders sagged under the invisible weight of his own shame. The decorations on his chest now felt more like accusations than honors. He didn't turn when Wallace's words echoed again in his mind. "You have humiliated a man who has done more for this nation than you ever will." Dorn's lips trembled. He took off his cap and set it down carefully on the bar. For the first time, he understood that authority without humility was emptiness. Rank without respect was nothing. Across the room, younger officers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier arrogance replaced by quiet contemplation. The realization rippled through them like a slow current. They had witnessed something sacred, something that stripped away all illusions of glory and left only truth. Kowalski finally broke the stillness. Straightening his back, he looked toward the others. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady now, "that man saved more lives than this room will ever hold. Let's make sure we never forget him, even if the world does." One by one, heads nodded. A few stepped forward, collecting the shards of glass from Kowalski's broken drink. No one told them to. It simply felt like the right thing to do. Outside, the cold air carried the faint echo of jet engines far in the distance. Somewhere beyond those clouds, the old ghosts of forgotten wars stirred, as if acknowledging that one of their own had finally found peace. Inside the car, Albert Kidding sat in silence as the road lights swept rhythmically across his face. The years seemed to fall away with each passing mile. He wasn't thinking of medals or names or regrets, only of the men who hadn't come home, and of the strange privilege of having carried their memory this far. "I wonder," he said quietly, not looking up, "how many like me are still out there, still sweeping floors, still fixing things that others don't notice?" General Wallace, seated beside him, replied softly, "More than anyone realizes, but maybe tonight reminded the world to look again." Albert nodded faintly. "Then that's enough." The car turned down a narrow road flanked by pine trees. Their branches swayed gently under the night wind, whispering the kind of peace that comes only to those who have carried too much for too long. As they approached the small airfield where a plane awaited, Wallace spoke again. "They'll never put your name on a wall, you know." Albert smiled, a weary but genuine smile. "Good," he said. "The walls have too many names already. Mine belongs with the ones no one writes down." The car stopped. The door opened. Cool air brushed against his face. Albert stepped out, straightening his jacket. Not the gray one he'd worn at the club, but a plain coat unmarked by rank or insignia. He looked toward the horizon, where dawn was just beginning to touch the sky with faint silver light. Somewhere behind him at the officers' club, the men he left behind still stood in quiet reflection. Each one changed in a way that could not be undone. And though his name would fade again into the folds of forgotten history, the lesson would remain, because that night, every man in that hall learned what true heroism looked like. It wasn't loud. It didn't wear medals. It didn't demand recognition. It was the steady hand of a man cleaning a forgotten glass case and the courage to serve when no one was watching.